When Russia launched its February 2022 invasion, one of its stated goals was the demilitarization of Ukraine. And indeed, by June 2023, Russian state media ran a headline suggesting that goal had mostly been accomplished. Shockingly enough, however, more than a year after that headline, the Russian military appears to still be locked in a grinding war of attrition against the Ukrainian armed forces, continuously applying firepower, manpower and materiel against Ukrainian defences, seemingly in order to slowly stretch, corrode and grind forward. It's an approach that has almost certainly destroyed far more Russian than Ukrainian equipment. But despite the disparity, Ukrainian equipment losses have still been immense. And Russia certainly began the invasion with more equipment in hand. It's a situation that raises a number of questions that I want to start looking at today. What have Ukrainian losses look like? What sort of resupply have they received? How is the force changing? And is the equipment picture improving or degrading over time? I'll start by looking at the potential impact of equipment quality, especially as Ukraine goes over to using more and more NATO equipment, and then start diving straight into questions of quantity. That'll mean looking at both the big picture of how Ukrainian losses have generally compared to Russian ones so far and what the wider resupply picture looks like, but also some deep dives into specific Ukrainian equipment categories: tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs and aircraft. Note that in this episode I won't be focusing either on air defence or artillery systems because they're likely to get their own coverage in the future, but I will close out with some broader observations about the way the Ukrainian army's equipment might be changing over time, and, perhaps more importantly, whether it has enough of it. But before I start hitting you with an array of graphs and stats, a word from a sponsor. And today I get to welcome back long-term channel sponsor and my VPN of choice, Private Internet Access. Whether you're absorbing YouTube content or trawling through satellite imagery, our modern online environment certainly has a lot to offer. But it can also feel like an environment that's steadily becoming more fragmented, and one with some potentially very rough edges when it comes to things like personal privacy and data breaches. When trying to look out for your privacy in that sort of environment, you might want to make sure you have the right combination of tools and practices. Much like the seatbelts and safety systems on an airplane, much of the time you might be fine without them. But if something strange does happen, you're probably going to be happy they're there. In an online environment, that might mean things like watching where you browse, keeping strong passwords, and maintaining a healthy distrust of things like links and attachments. And then, if you're like me, you'll also want a VPN. With a click, what a VPN allows you to do is reroute your internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, while also potentially changing how your traffic is logged, noting that Private Internet Access has a no-logs policy that's reportedly been both audited and tested in court. They offer servers in 91 different countries, plus, if you want a little extra precision, there are also servers in 50 US states. All in the context of software which is advertised as being open source, available cross-platform, and compatible with a range of streaming services. Plus, you probably won't have to worry about juggling multiple accounts because a single subscription will cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you are interested, there'll be a link in the description that'll give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, covering an unlimited number of devices and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So with my genuine thanks to a long-running sponsor, let's get back to it. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago at time of recording, we looked at some of the available evidence for Russian heavy equipment losses in Ukraine and tried to get an understanding of how deep their remaining reserves might go. But in order to better understand where the balance of this war of attrition might drift long-term, we probably have to repeat that exercise for the Ukrainians. To a great extent, a lot of the harsh arithmetic of war here is going to be very similar. How much did the Ukrainians start with? How quickly are they losing it compared to the invading Russians? And what does the pipeline look like in terms of both the quality and quantity of replacements? But compared to that work on Russia, I think there's a couple of differences in Ukraine's situation that we have to try and reflect. For example, comparatively speaking, stored equipment is less of a concern for the Ukrainians than the Russians. Compared to just about any other European state, Ukraine did begin the war with an immense amount of equipment in storage. We're talking hundreds of tanks, airframes that could be reactivated, retired ammunition, etc. And as you can see on the right there, from that image from, I believe, 2018, Ukrainian storage standards for some of that reserved equipment were almost Russian. We've seen plenty of evidence that some of this equipment is being reactivated, both in terms of what we're seeing appear on the battlefields, the announcements of the Ukrainian government, and also programs like the one you see on the right there, where the Czech government announced that their industry would be assisting the Ukrainians with reactivating old T-64s. If you want a very rough guesstimate for how many reserved main battle tanks the Ukrainians have repaired or reactivated since February 2022, I put it in the low triple digits. But compared to the Russian Federation, Ukraine has nowhere near the same breadth of stored equipment, nor the same reliance on it. Ukraine doesn't have anything like Russia's stockpiles of old Soviet artillery systems, for example, which means when we're modelling force endurance, another factor has to come into play. Instead, in Ukraine's case, we have to put a much greater weighting on the importance of Allied resupply. This is obviously a factor for Russia too, especially when you're talking about things like drones from Iran or ammunition from North Korea. But in Ukraine's case, what equipment is being donated and what equipment we expect them to receive in the future is a much more important part of the analysis. For the purpose of today's episode, I'm generally going to be counting any heavy equipment that has either been delivered or explicitly pledged as equipment that is supplied. We're generally going to proceed on the assumption that Ukraine is going to receive everything it's been promised and nothing more. I also won't be analysing NATO's equipment levels or storages this episode because, frankly, with a couple of niche exceptions, the limitation on resupply to Ukraine is almost always going to be a question of politics and priority more than raw availability. Across basically every equipment category, Ukraine's allies have access to far, far more heavy equipment than Russia does. Colloquially, we might refer to Russia and Ukraine as being low on equipment once they're a couple of steps away from shovels and Molotov cocktails. Elsewhere, being short might mean not having a spare army or two worth of armoured vehicles parked in the desert, like the United States, or having some of the largest armoured forces in Europe pointed at each other, as in the case of Greece and Turkey. For Ukraine, often the question is there equipment out there? It's whether they'll be given access to it. The other thing that sets Ukraine's equipment position apart is the unique role played by arguably its greatest equipment donor, the Russian Federation. Captured equipment plays a much, much greater role for the Ukrainians than it does for the Russians. That's true both because Ukraine had less equipment to begin with and is also believed to have captured far more of it. At time of recording, the Ukrainians have visually confirmed to have captured about 3,000 pieces of heavy equipment. The number is about 1,000 going in the other direction. And over the course of the war, we've seen entire Ukrainian units sometimes re-equipped with stuff of Russian origin. So whereas this was mostly an afterthought for our Russia analysis, here it's going to be much more front and centre. Now, before we start jumping into aggregate numbers around losses and resupply, there's another side of the coin I wanted to explore first: quality. When we talked about Russian losses and resupply 2 weeks ago, this question was really important because, over time, Russia is using more and more older equipment. We had to understand the potential difference that using a T-62 or D-20 howitzer might make over the much more modern designs that dominated the pre-invasion Russian force. A one-to-one quantitative replacement in those cases may not mean a one-to-one replacement in combat power. With Ukraine, the question's also important, but sometimes runs in the other direction. What's the impact of going from a Soviet howitzer to a PZH-2000, or from a BMP to a Bradley? It's been said that quantity can have a quality all of its own, but quality can also have a quality all of its own. The basic question then is, to what extent does that actually matter, or is a tank and a gun a gun? Intuitively, in some cases the answer is obviously going to be yes, and in others not so much. The impact might be intuitive when the higher quality piece of equipment allows you to do something that is significantly different to what the lower quality piece enabled. In a war with very slow-moving front lines, for example, range is an obvious example here. If you need to hit targets 60 kilometres behind the line, for example, no amount of systems with 40-kilometre ranges are going to allow you to service that target. Longer-ranged artillery might have a massive advantage in counter-battery engagements, and longer-range anti-aircraft systems might actually be able to hit aircraft using standoff weapons like glide bombs. In other cases, the impact of a quality differential might be much more narrow. All of that, however, is just based on anecdotes and what's intuitive. If you're watching this channel, however, you're probably interested in what the data, as imperfect and incomplete as it might be, may be able to tell us about some of the impacts equipment quality can have for Ukrainian forces. If you watch interviews or talk to some of the Ukrainian personnel that use some of the better NATO equipment, one thing they'll often seem to say is that it's better designed from a survivability perspective. Yes, your vehicle might still be knocked out by a mine, an ATGM, or a loitering munition, but even if the vehicle's done, the crew might survive to fight another day. When you're talking about modern IFVs or tanks, that sort of feedback might make a degree of sense from a design perspective, as Soviet engineers were often just working with a different design philosophy and different design priorities to their NATO counterparts. And while we don't really have data from both sides on how many crew on average survive whenever a given vehicle type is hit, we can kind of hunt for clues using the visually confirmed loss data. The best clue for us here on how likely a crew was to survive comes down to what a vehicle looks like when it becomes a loss. Differentiating between vehicles that have been thoroughly destroyed as compared to those that have merely been damaged and knocked out is one of the most subjective and difficult things when it comes to operating these VC databases. It's also always possible that a vehicle was initially lightly damaged and then later thoroughly destroyed by, for example, a follow-up drone attack. But all else being equal, I think it's a fairly safe assumption to make that more crew and passengers will survive a vehicle being knocked out and looking like this afterwards, something that would be classified as damaged, abandoned, and captured in the database, as compared to a destroyed vehicle like this one, where the burnt-out husk of the hull is in Ukraine, and the turret may be exploring a new career as an anti-satellite weapon. And while it's generally possible for any vehicle to end up anywhere on that spectrum, from lightly damaged all the way through to catastrophically destroyed, the data we have suggests that in Ukraine, they don't do so at regular rates. What you're looking at on screen there now is a chart showing Ukrainian visually confirmed losses for 3 infantry fighting vehicles: the BMP-1, BMP-2, and the American Bradley. I chose these 3 vehicles because the BMP-1 and BMP-2 are the most common infantry fighting vehicles in Ukrainian service, with the BMP-2 obviously being the somewhat better vehicle, while the Bradley was selected because it's the only Western infantry fighting vehicle where the number of visually confirmed losses, which is approaching 100 at this point, gives us a sample size large enough for this exercise to potentially be worth doing. The colour coding on the bar splits those losses into 3 types. Blue are those that appear to have been at least lightly damaged, orange are those that have been damaged and then either abandoned or captured. Abandoned vehicles may or may not be recovered by either side, but the key point is the crew may have had more chance to survive, while the red represents those that are classified as destroyed. Just in case that previous graph was a little hard to read because more BMP-1s have been lost than the other 2 types, this is it expressed as a percentage of losses for each platform. Immediately you'll see something interesting. The distribution for the BMP-1 and BMP-2, so more than 600 vehicles combined across those 2 categories, are pretty close. In both cases, the blue bar is relatively small and the destroyed percentage is around 80%. Meanwhile, for the Bradley, you see a lot less red and a lot more blue. And while the difference between blue and orange might matter if you're concerned with whether or not the side permanently lost the vehicle as a result of the engagement, from a crew survivability perspective, it might be useful to group them together as non-catastrophic losses. And that's exactly what you can see here, with all those damaged, abandoned and captured categories grouped together into the green bar, while the destroyed vehicles are marked in red. I need to stress this is in no way a perfect proxy for crew survivability, but the pattern there is fairly stark. If you are in a Ukrainian BMP-1 or BMP-2 and you become a visually confirmed loss, there's about an 80% chance that you're in a vehicle that is going to be thoroughly destroyed. If you're in a Bradley, then statistically the destroyed percentage drops below 50%. That means that if this was a perfect proxy, and everyone in a damaged vehicle tended to survive while everyone in a destroyed vehicle tended to not, your odds of survival for those experienced IFV operators or the infantry carried would be more than 2.5 times higher in an American Bradley than it would be in a BMP-1 or 2. And that's before we factor in things like the fact we often see infantry riding on the top of the BMP-1 or 2 rather than in the infantry compartment, which means you absolutely will see some drone footage where the infantry riding on top become casualties without the vehicle being knocked out. The problem with trying to do this sort of analysis for other NATO vehicles that Ukraine has received is that often the sample sizes are just too low, and that leaves the data vulnerable to being skewed by a range of factors that might have nothing to do with the basic survivability of the vehicle. But because those factors can also be interesting, let me quickly tell you a story of 3 tanks. Over the course of the war, Ukraine has received hundreds of tanks from its allies, including relatively small numbers of some of NATO's best. These include the British Challenger 2, the American M1A1 Abrams, and some later versions of the German Leopard, including the 2A6 from Germany itself and the 122 from Sweden. You could occupy internet experts for days at a time with debates over the comparative virtues of these vehicles. To give a non-tanker's opinion, they're all capable, established MBT designs. But if you expect age to correspond with survivability, you'd probably give the advantage to the German Leopard 2A6, as well as the Swedish version, which is related to the earlier 2A5 with a major focus on vehicle and crew survivability. Then you might look at the visually confirmed loss data and quickly conclude those Leopard 2A6s and Strv 122s are obviously death traps, with 18 examples appearing in the loss data against about 31 supplied. The loss rate for the M1A1 Abrams is much lower at around 30%, and the British Challenger 2 looks absolutely incredible, with more than 90% of the fleet still undamaged. So, does this mean we should all start yelling Rule Britannia and standardise on the Challenger 3 as NATO's new main battle tank? Well, before you get too excited and start trying to figure out where the Poms will fit their new tank mega factory, we can flip the graph into one categorising the type of loss. It's suddenly the Swedish Strv 122, which is by far the most survivable vehicle in our set, while there are probably VBIEDs out there with better graphs than the Challenger 2. With 100% of Challenger 2 losses being catastrophically destroyed rather than damaged, if you fed that figure to an AI with no other context, it might conclude the Challenger 2 is a less survivable vehicle than the BMP-1. So, what's going on here? Issue 1 is that the bar says 100% because only one Challenger 2 has been lost in Ukraine, and it looked like this. Problem 2 is that when only a few vehicles are involved rather than hundreds or thousands, they tend to be concentrated in specific units and potentially used in different ways. Ukraine is believed to have received 14 Challenger 2s from the United Kingdom, and they appear to have gone to the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. There have been a couple of interviews with tankers from the 82nd who have described how they have generally used the Challenger 2 and how they evaluate it compared to other tanks. Most of them praised the combination of accuracy and protection on the Challenger 2 and described using it for relatively long-range engagements. The one on the right there, for example, describes engaging Russian defensive positions from ranges of between 2.6 and 2.8 kilometres. That is a long way from maximum range for potential tank engagements, but it's also not exactly urban warfare. Another interview I found talked about preferring the lighter T-80 for close-in assault work, due to a combination of factors like the Challenger's weight on one hand and its comparative accuracy on the other. Whatever the case may be, it sounds like you have the entire tank force concentrated in a single veteran unit that, at least anecdotally, talks about using them in a relatively conservative fashion. And there might be some threats that you're comparatively less likely to encounter if you're mostly doing long-range work with a vehicle. Think anti-tank mines. Meanwhile, a lot of the Leopard 2A6s found themselves being used as the spearhead of the Ukrainian offensive in June 2023. They were largely handed over to mechanised units and used for some of the most difficult jobs a unit could be assigned, breaching prepared enemy defences under fire. In a sense, you could argue this represented just another example of a phenomenon we've seen many times before on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, some of the better available equipment being allocated to do the most dangerous and difficult of jobs. But without sufficient engineering assets to clear the minefields, no ATACMS to suppress Russian attack helicopters, and all of the other factors that went into limiting the amount of progress that Ukrainian offensive made, a fair number of these very expensive tanks ended up being knocked out or destroyed relatively quickly. Finally, the loss picture for the M1 Abrams has been different again and can best be described as bumpy. The vehicle avoided taking any losses during the breaching phase of the Ukrainian 2023 offensive because it hadn't yet arrived. And even once they did arrive, the losses we've seen have mostly been very clustered. 10 Abrams have so far appeared on the visually confirmed loss list, compared to 32 supplied, but most of those losses appear to have been clustered in a relatively short span of time, when it appears they may have been committed to blunt a Russian offensive. The reason I bring this up is because A, it's interesting, and B, because I think it serves as a warning against jumping to conclusions based on incomplete data, and to suggest we should probably think twice before replacing all the modern main battle tanks in NATO inventories with vehicles the data suggests are obviously much more survivable, like, the T-55. You can't always blindly trust the data. So where does all that leave us if we're trying to assess what impact quality might have on Ukrainian combat power going forward? Without a whole bunch of additional information, the safest conclusion is probably that it matters, but we can't be sure how much it matters. Although I imagine that for Ukrainian troops who end up surviving because they were in the back of a Bradley rather than a BMP, the answer is already, at least at a personal level, all the difference in the world. But now it's probably time to start talking about the quantity side of the resupply and loss picture. And in order to do that, there's a couple of assumptions I need to advance up front, all of which relate to some of the biggest unknowns when it comes to equipment resupply. Firstly, we generally don't have very good public estimates over how much equipment the Ukrainians themselves are producing or reactivating. We know that budget is being allocated to it and that it is happening, but other than a couple of cases where I'll try and reverse engineer out a rough estimate of Ukrainian production, for the most part, most of the figures you're about to see assume the Ukrainian Defence Industrial Base has been on extended vacation since February 2022. Assumption 2 relates to how we count captured Russian equipment. Especially in the earlier stages of the war, this may have been Ukraine's most significant source of heavy equipment resupply. And with nearly 3,000 pieces of equipment marked as captured in the visually confirmed loss databases at time of recording, we can't exactly ignore it. At the same time, I think it would be massively over-optimistic to assume that every piece of equipment captured can be repaired, put back into service, and then maintained in service. So as in the past, when I'm calculating inflows, I'm going to divide the number of visually confirmed captured vehicles by 3. Basically assuming that if you capture 3 T-80s, for example, you're probably going to be able to cobble together enough parts to operate at least one of them. Finally, there are often a whole range of ambiguities around foreign military assistance and equipment deliveries. Some states provide military assistance, but never announce what equipment is in the packages. Others might announce equipment, but with ambiguous timelines, and it never being entirely clear what has or hasn't been delivered. Unless otherwise noted, because we don't have any data to go on, we're going to assume that secret deliveries don't exist. We're also often going to be bundling together equipment that has been pledged with equipment that has already been delivered. We'll break things out occasionally, but for the most part we're interested in the replacement pipeline, not just what's already arrived. Okay, so with that discussion around quality complete, let's get into the much more data-friendly issue of quantities. And the way I thought we'd do this is start with the big picture around Ukrainian losses, then the question of inputs, and then put it all together for a more detailed look at specific equipment categories. Of course, until the AI apocalypse plays out, all of that equipment is going to need people to operate it. So I think it's worth putting a note up front about the much harder topic to assess, manpower losses and replacements. We can be fairly confident that Ukraine has taken significant casualties over the course of this war, and earlier this year I pointed to some of the evidence that serious manpower shortages were in play. Actions to address that manpower shortage were arguably significantly delayed, although eventually we did see changes to Ukrainian mobilisation rules. They finally passed in Ukraine a couple of months ago at this point, and reports indicate that induction rates have now increased significantly. Any determination of whether or not these changes are likely to be enough to meet Ukraine's manpower requirements probably needs to wait a few more months. But I will note that in amongst all this, we have seen some interesting initiatives, including the formation of what has often been called a Polish Legion. The name there is arguably a little bit of a misnomer, because this is intended to be a volunteer unit formed of Ukrainian men currently living in Poland. Basically, what the Polish government has said, to paraphrase Foreign Minister Sikorski, is that many of these Ukrainian men do want to serve, do want to help rotate their compatriots, but many have also expressed concerns about things like training standards or their ability to eventually rejoin their families. So to answer those concerns, the Poles have set up a volunteer unit that will be trained by Polish forces first and then deployed to Ukraine as a cohesive unit. The recruits won't be broken up to be sent as individual replacements to various other units of the Ukrainian military. They'll stick together and fight as a unit. And reportedly, within a couple of days of the initiative being announced, several thousand had already registered. I think it'll be interesting to see going forward both whether or not the Polish model works and whether other European states adopt it. To quote the Polish foreign minister, "If every European country did that, Ukraine would have several brigades." End quote. And one imagines that given these are volunteer units that are meant to be properly trained before being deployed, they may have relatively good combat power compared to other green units. But even if Ukraine is able to address some of its manpower shortages, materiel concerns are likely to remain acute. The country began the war with less heavy equipment than the Russian Federation, significantly increased the size of its military without a commensurate increase in the amount of heavy equipment available, and importantly for this part of the analysis, has also lost a lot of heavy equipment in nearly 2.5 years of fighting. The first question then is, how much? What you're seeing on screen here are Ukrainian losses across different equipment categories, according to two very different sources. Those orange bars on the right are visually confirmed losses, including vehicles that were only damaged, which I think serves well as a kind of soft floor to the estimate. The red bars on the left represent an impossibly high upper-end estimate, namely the claims of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And as you can see, there is a slight difference between them, but I bring them up to illustrate a point around potential overclaiming. Both sides are likely to be overclaiming, that's pretty much just the historical default for anyone fighting a war, but the data seems to suggest that the scale at which they're doing so is very different. What you're seeing on screen there is a chart showing the relationship between the claims by both sides and the visual evidence for them. That 15% for Russian aircraft claims, for example, means that for every 100 Ukrainian aircraft that Russia claims to have destroyed, we have evidence for about 15. On the other side, for every 100 Russian aircraft Ukraine claims to have permanently grounded, we have evidence for about 33. The difference there is between overclaiming the evidence by about 3-1 and roughly 7-1. For every 100 Russian rocket artillery systems the Ukrainians claim to destroy, we have visual evidence for about 35. An overclaim rate, or perhaps a better term here is actually evidence ratio, of less than 3-1. For the Russians, every 100 Ukrainian systems claimed will come with evidence of about 6, an evidence ratio of closer to 17-1. Going forward, I'm mostly going to be using visually confirmed loss data for reasons I've discussed extensively before, but I thought that discrepancy was interesting enough to be worth surfacing. Very generally speaking, Ukrainian claims tend to be likely high, but at least possible, while if the Russian claims were true, the Ukrainians would have been defending the streets of their capital with thrown bricks and harsh language, probably back in 2023. What you're seeing on screen now, then, are the visually confirmed losses for both Russia and Ukraine across different equipment categories. And I think the graph serves to highlight at least two observations. The first is that, leaving Russian losses aside for a moment, this war has undoubtedly destroyed a massive amount of Ukrainian equipment. Nearly 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, more than 860 tanks, around 600 artillery systems and 500 APCs, to name just a few. The second observation is that while throughout this war Russia has consistently lost heavy equipment at a much higher rate than the Ukrainians, the difference between the two isn't consistent across the categories. You'll often hear that Russia has very generally had about 3 times the visually confirmed equipment losses as the Ukrainians over the course of the invasion, but to an extent, they haven't been losing the same stuff. For a lot of the real heavy metal categories, think tanks, infantry fighting vehicles and AFVs, the ratio is often closer to 4-1. For multiple rocket launchers, around 7-1. And in the command and communication category, nearly 15-1, 283-19. But there are also categories, quite numerically significant categories, where Ukraine has been losing more vehicles than the Russians have. The thing is, these tend to generally be comparatively lighter categories of equipment that NATO has been able to supply in large numbers. For example, the Ukrainians have lost more than 480 infantry mobility vehicles, think things like Humvees, compared to the Russian 265, a ratio of 1.8-1. The ratio for MRAPs, wheeled mine-resistant vehicles, think things like the Max Pro or the Bushmaster, is closer to 4-1. On one hand, as we'll discuss later, this might signal that Ukraine is comparatively short on heavy equipment and has to use more light stuff instead. On the other hand, it also suggests that wider 3-1 ratio across all categories might not truly represent the scale of the difference we've seen so far. If you're trying to win a long-term war of attrition, you probably don't want to be trading tanks and infantry fighting vehicles for Humvees and M113s. But whatever the disparity between the two sides, the fact is, especially once you account for non-visually confirmed or non-combat losses, those graphs show a huge amount of Ukrainian equipment that needed replacement. This brings us to the question of inputs that Ukraine has turned to balance out their losses. Overall, the most important source has almost certainly been deliveries from abroad. At this point, dozens of nations have supported Ukraine with various financial and military resources. Some have done so very loudly, giving us specific numbers and delivery timelines whenever new aid is forthcoming. Others, like Finland, have been forthright about the fact that aid is being sent, but not about what's in each potentially explosive shipment. And then, somewhere in between, there are those that appear to have tried to be transparent, but sometimes seem to have a little bit of trouble with the accounting. With the US recently announcing that they'd found another roughly $2 billion overcount in the amount of equipment that had been sent to Ukraine, because once again, equipment appears to have been valued based on how much it would cost to replace it with new equipment, as opposed to how much the old stuff was actually worth. Understanding those ambiguities as best we can, the chart on screen shows some rough estimates for how much equipment across various equipment categories is estimated to have been pledged or delivered to Ukraine from foreign sources. As you can see, Ukraine's been receiving serious numbers of some lighter systems like MRAPs, APCs, and infantry mobility vehicles, things like Humvees, but also a fair amount of metal on those heavier line items. Overall, the pledges amount to about 900 tanks, more than 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 3,500 armoured personnel carriers, and more than 5,000 infantry mobility vehicles, including 3,000 plus Humvees. That might sound like a lot of Humvees, but we have to remember the US reportedly left the Taliban with about 12,000 of them. The other key input we're concerned with capturing today is equipment the Ukrainians have managed to get from the Russians. Even before the first heavy equipment deliveries began from NATO states, the tractor brigades were at it in Ukraine, and a significant number of Russian vehicles found their colours turned. At time of recording, the estimated more than 2,900 pieces of captured equipment include more than 500 tanks, 271 AFVs, 616 IFVs, and an embarrassingly large number of command vehicles. But while I think it's important to model the fact that this mode of equipment acquisition was no doubt significant for the Ukrainians, those figures don't include the divide by 3 adjustment that I would generally suggest. And I think the data suggests that significant aid packages from the Russians may be less common going forward. What you can see on screen here is the change in the number of tanks, IFVs and AFVs captured by the Ukrainians across 3 distinct periods. What you can see on screen here are massive numbers for captured vehicles during that February to May 2022 period, even larger numbers between May 22 and May 2023, and then low or in some cases even negative numbers for May 2023 through 24. I think the most likely explanation here is that these 3 time periods reflect very different stages of the war and different major events. February to May 2022 is the era of the Kyiv goodwill gesture, where the Russians apparently demonstrated the scale of their goodwill by leaving hundreds of armoured vehicles behind as they pulled out of Ukraine's north. The year between May 2022 and May 2023 includes such minor events as the Kharkiv counteroffensive. That saw Russian defence lines collapse, a number of major bases overrun, with huge amounts of equipment left behind or vacuumed up in the process. Both of those represent periods of relatively rapid movement, a time when vehicles might be left behind or overrun and thus more likely to be captured. By contrast, that final 12-month period has been overwhelmingly dominated by relatively static fighting. Vehicles being lost might be lost in the grey zone or behind enemy lines, making them very difficult to recover. And during that period, they were also probably more likely to be subjected to follow-up attack by drop drones or FPVs, which we've often seen used to completely destroy vehicles in order to prevent them being recovered. The collapse in the rate of equipment captured is so great that with tanks you actually see a negative number, meaning the list got smaller over those 12 months. This reflects the fact that over time you're constantly seeing efforts to try and find and remove duplicate entries from the databases, and that where visual evidence emerges of what was presumed to be a captured vehicle being destroyed, for example by a follow-up FPV strike, that vehicle will then, if possible, be reclassified from captured to destroyed. Normally that process is all but invisible in the data because new losses being reported tend to be more than enough to compensate. But as capture rates dived over those 12 months, those corrections and changes became very visible. The key takeaway is that Ukraine is probably even more dependent now on domestic production and allied deliveries than it was in 2022 or 2023. The Russian military may have fronted the Ukrainians a build-your-own mechanised force starter pack or two, but it's hard to imagine capture rates climbing to those sort of levels again unless the lines become much more dynamic. But now, with some of that big picture around equipment losses and inflows in place, I want to start weaving all those items together and try to better understand or at least guesstimate how things might be netting out for different parts of the Ukrainian force. So to jump into some specific equipment categories, if we're leaving artillery and air defence systems for a future episode, I figured we could go for something of a heavy metal opening. So let's talk tanks. At a big picture level, tanks have had a rather interesting war in Ukraine so far, especially from a PR perspective. There was the early panic over whether this war signalled the end of the tank, and in 2024 we've seen time and time again that heavy armour can be vulnerable to a range of systems, including landmines, ATGMs and drones. I've heard testimony from people who've fought in Ukraine that they as infantry don't want to be anywhere near the friendly tanks because of the sheer amount of shit they tend to attract. But, despite those drawbacks, both sides also continue to swear by them. We've seen them used defensively to stage armoured ambushes, offensively to lead assaults, deployed as essentially very heavily armoured artillery systems, or used to pick apart defensive positions, fortifications and structures before infantry move in for assault actions. In other words, tanks in Ukraine have proven to be vulnerable, but then again, so too is basically everything. And the combination of a big gun and hopefully decent sensors on a mobile and well-protected platform still seems to be something that the armies can appreciate. While there have obviously been some peaks and troughs, overall Ukrainian tank loss figures show a degree of stability. What you can see on screen there are the approximate visually confirmed losses for the period May to June 2022, May to June 2023, and May to June 2024. I've chosen these time periods to try and give a somewhat like-to-like comparison between the 3 years, while leaving aside the somewhat dramatic outlier that was the very earliest stages of the invasion. What you can arguably see is that while there is an uptick in the middle there, which has probably corresponded with the beginning of Ukraine's 2023 offensive, the burn rate between the 3 periods doesn't appear to have swung that wildly. What that might suggest to us, even though it's clearly not enough information in and of itself, is that unless the loss rates of the tanks that are active has been changing significantly over time, the total size of the fleet has probably remained relatively stable. That would broadly align with the February assessment by the IFVS that at the time of that report's writing, quote, "We estimate that 2 years after the full-scale invasion, the number of MBTs in service with the Ukrainian armed forces remains near pre-war levels." If that's true, the whole demilitarization thing is clearly going super well. As we saw from those loss charts earlier, a stable Ukrainian MBT inventory can't be because they're not losing tanks. They are, and they've lost a lot of them. Roughly 870 destroyed, damaged or captured as at time of recording. But against those estimated losses, there have also been significant inflows. About 900 main battle tanks have been pledged to Ukraine by its various allies, of which about 2/3 are believed to have been delivered. For the most part, you can think of those pledges as falling into 3 very broad waves. There was a massive initial surge of Soviet and post-Soviet designs that began quite early in 2022, then a push leading up to the 2023 offensive to get Ukraine at least some modern Western main battle tanks to augment its force, and then what appears to basically be a numbers-making exercise to get Ukraine some older NATO tanks, specifically the Leopard 1, although a vast majority of those are being reactivated from storage and so haven't made it to the battlefield yet. I also note there's sometimes a tendency in coverage to dismiss the importance of smaller announcements that we do see from time to time, such as the recent report that the Netherlands and Denmark will be sending another 14 Leopard 2A4s to Ukraine this summer. We're now at the point that over 100 Leopard 2s or related designs like the Strv-122 have been pledged or delivered to Ukraine, and for the most part that figure's been built up one small announcement at a time. While there have been a huge array of countries involved in trying to get Ukraine more battle tanks, there are a couple of efforts that appear to have really moved the needle from a supply perspective. The largest single line item for Allied tank supply to Ukraine probably remains Poland's 250 plus T-72s and 60 PT-91s. The problem from the Ukrainian perspective is that much like Russia's donations in 2022 and 2023, it seems very unlikely we'll be seeing those sort of donated numbers from Poland again in the near future, as the country is now left waiting for deliveries of new main battle tanks, such as its K2s from Korea. The most common single type of NATO tank to be delivered by contrast is likely to be the Leopard 1, with about 155 either in the pipeline or already delivered. And of course, we can't forget Moscow's generous contributions that we discussed earlier, although as per our stated assumptions, I'm only going to assume about a third of them can be put into action. Put that all together and you get the chart you see here. What I've done is broken up the visually confirmed losses and potential inflows, things like captured vehicles, domestic production or foreign support, and divided those into Soviet, post-Soviet and related vehicles on the top and NATO-type vehicles on the bottom. In part based on the data work we did back in the Russian losses episode, for illustrative purposes I very roughly estimated the number of Ukrainian tanks reactivated from storage at about 200 since February 2022. Net that all together and you end up with Ukraine being up by about 470 tanks overall, 270 if you leave out the reactivation component. Adjust down for approximately 300 of the pledged tanks being shown here not having been delivered yet, and you end up with the Ukrainian fleet being slightly negative if you don't account for reactivation, to slightly positive if you do. In other words, you're at the sort of point where potential errors in every direction, be it losses that don't become visually confirmed or damaged vehicles that end up being repaired rather than written off, could fairly easily move the result either side of zero. To me, what that suggests, and we could very easily be wrong, is that after nearly 2.5 years of hard attritional fighting, the active Ukrainian tank fleet is probably pretty close to where it began, with the biggest changes being the shift in the composition of the force, not the size of it. Moving on, let's look at a core component of many mechanised forces in Ukraine, the infantry fighting vehicle. Perhaps even more so than tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, especially the old BMP series, have been absolutely ubiquitous in both Ukrainian and Russian service. They're intended to combine the ability to transport or attempt to transport infantry safely across a very dangerous battlefield, and pack a useful amount of firepower, often in the form of an autocannon and or missile armament. By comparison, armoured personnel carriers, like the American M113, would normally be expected to lean much more into the sort of battle taxi role, providing some protection to the troops they carry, but often having a significantly lesser armament. Both types of vehicles can serve to protect infantry from things like shrapnel, but you probably don't want to be using them in the same sort of way that you would use the more heavily armed IFVs. As you can see on screen there, Ukraine's loss patterns for the two vehicle types have changed in different ways over time. In both cases, Ukrainian losses in May to June 2023, leading into the Ukrainian counteroffensive, were significantly higher than in May to June 2022. But the rate of increase was significantly different. APC losses more than tripled, while IFV losses increased by about 75%. Then in May to June 2024, with Ukraine now back on the defensive, IFV losses would drop back a bit, while APC losses would continue to grow. Adjusting for the very different state of the war across those three time periods, what this would seem to suggest is the Ukrainian IFV fleet has probably been broadly stable between 2023 and 2024, assuming you're likely to lose fewer vehicles on the defence than the attack. While all else being equal, you'd probably guess that the APC fleet has grown. And to test that idea a bit, we can start to pick apart the visually confirmed losses and the estimated resupply. As with the tanks, what I've done on screen here is split up the visually confirmed losses, announced pledges or purchases, and an estimate of vehicles captured into the Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian category on the top and the NATO vehicle category on the bottom. What it shows is Ukraine falling short on replacing its losses of Soviet infantry fighting vehicles while running a surplus on NATO ones. Ukraine's visually confirmed to have lost about 830 Soviet IFVs for an inflow of about 670. For NATO infantry fighting vehicles, it's a loss of 137 against an inflow of 729. I'd also note that, as you see on screen there, the Ukrainian BMP fleet, at least on paper, is only avoiding being in an even worse state because of an inflow of an estimated 205 recovered captured vehicles. A number which is only possible because Ukraine is visually confirmed to have captured a staggering 616 from the Russians at time of recording. If you net those figures for Soviet and NATO IFVs together, Ukraine ends up positive by about 430 vehicles. But if you then adjust down for the fact that potentially hundreds of these vehicles may not have been delivered yet, you end up with a much more humble increase. More or less what the lost data appeared to be hinting at a moment ago. While there are a lot of estimates involved in that calculation, I think what is abundantly clear is that whatever the size of the IFV inventory, the composition of that inventory in Ukraine is absolutely changing over time. Replacements may not be enough to keep up with BMP losses, while pledges of NATO infantry fighting vehicles have so far outstripped losses. There are several NATO IFV designs we've seen become more common over time. These include the German Marder, of which Ukraine has already received more than 100 and will eventually receive 140 in total, I believe. The US-made Bradley has been even more significant and fought a number of high-profile engagements. Ukraine is believed to have received just over 300 Bradleys at this point, and there's a question over how many more might be received in the future. The Swedish CV90 has appeared in much smaller numbers, but I bring it up here because this is the vehicle with potentially the longest tail. With both the Bradleys and the Marters, generally what Ukraine expects to receive is older, reserved or reactivated stock. With the CV90, we've actually seen plans for some new build production that might sustain the force into the future. In that respect, you might describe the CV90 as being for the Ukrainians what BMP-3 is for the Russians. The modern option that isn't available in anywhere near sufficient numbers now, but which will continue to trickle into the force long term because it's the one in active production. Although it has to be said there's a wide gap between the number of BMP-3s that Russia is believed to be producing and the rate of anticipated CV90 production for Ukraine. Before we move on, I do want to flag one potential anomaly that does come through in the IFV data. For most types of IFVs in Ukraine, there tends to be a relatively intuitive relationship between visually confirmed losses and the number of vehicles supplied. 3 times as many Bradleys have been sent as Marters, and Bradley losses are about 3.5 times Marter losses. The anomaly, though, comes in when we're talking about the Polish Wolverine IFV. It was announced back in April 2023 that Ukraine would be getting 200 of these things, including 100 in the very short term. We then did start to see images of the vehicles in Ukraine being apparently operated by Ukrainian troops. So by those accounts, the Wolverine should be the second most numerous NATO IFV in Ukrainian service, second only to the American Bradley. But while we've seen 93 Bradley losses, 20 Marters and 6 CV90s, the total visually confirmed loss figure for the Wolverine is 4. Unless the Poles have secretly found a way to manufacture IFVs out of adamantium, I'm not sure I have a ready answer to this quirk in the data. There are any number of things that could be driving it. Deliveries could be less than anticipated. The vehicles may have been allocated to less dangerous fronts, been very lucky and not destroyed as often, or when destroyed, not photographed as often. It may also simply have just been used in a very different way by the Ukrainians, because while it does have an IFV-type armament, the Wolverine, unlike the Bradley, Marder, CV90 and BMPs, is a wheeled vehicle, not a tracked one. But in the absence of a definitive answer, for now I'll just leave this mystery to the audience. While Ukrainian IFV losses and resupply figures have, at least on paper, remained relatively closely balanced, those same figures for armoured personnel carriers very much haven't. As you can see there, the picture for Soviet, Russian and Ukrainian designs, mostly things like BTRs, has remained relatively balanced, but the visually confirmed loss of fewer than 300 NATO APCs has so far been balanced by announced inflows of more than 3,300, producing a total net on paper position of positive 3,060 vehicles. Accounting for vehicles that may have been pledged but not yet delivered lowers that figure to around positive 1,700, but hopefully we can all agree that even by the standards of this war, that's still a lot of vehicles. And a lot of that figure has been made up by various versions of an old Cold War stalwart, the American-designed M113. In terms of NATO APCs, the M113 is about as simple as it gets. In its basic version, the thing is basically a metal box to which you add some armour plate, an engine, and some tracks. Troops can then hide inside said metal box while it drives around, because marching long distances in a heavy pack sucks, and so too does shrapnel. As to which of those two things sucks more, that will probably come down to the individual infantryman you talk to. If you go through public Ukrainian reviews of the M113, you'll find things they generally like its simplicity, and some things that are viewed less favourably. In an ideal world, this probably wouldn't be the vehicle they'd be getting, with a focus instead on more IFVs or modern APCs. But as I previously indicated, I think as far back as 2022, if Ukraine's allies were ever going to try and supply anywhere close to the sheer number of armoured vehicles that the country likely needs, and even more, try and do it without providing 30 distinct designs, thus extending the torture already experienced by Ukrainian maintainers, the M113 was always going to be one of the only potential answers. Because basically everyone in NATO has them, they have a lot of them, and also basically no one wants them. As you can see on screen there, Ukraine is believed to have received M113s from the Netherlands, Lithuania, Australia, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Spain, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and a casual 900, including 300 medical vehicles from the United States of America. That's a lot of metal boxes, but to give a sense of perspective, it's still fewer than the more than 1,000 vehicles the US supplied to the Iraqis. M113 is not a particularly modern, well-armed or well-protected vehicle, but you can potentially fit dozens or hundreds of the things into an aid package that might otherwise pay for a handful of tanks or maybe 1 or 2 air defense systems. and so we should probably expect to see more and more of them appearing in Ukraine as time goes on, not just as basic APCs, but also as an array of specialised vehicles, especially since, as we'll come back to, you still see plenty of cases of Ukrainian units having to use unarmoured civilian vehicles to do things like evacuate wounded, when a dedicated armoured option would probably be preferable. Ukraine likely has far more APCs than it started with, but they probably also wouldn't say no to a couple of thousand more. While the Ukrainian ground forces may be treading water in some equipment categories and potentially building up in others, I think the data suggests that the Ukrainian Air Force is in a much more difficult position. If you just look at the headline picture, you might get the impression things are relatively neutral. 97 visually confirmed aircraft losses at time of recording, up against slightly more than 130 aircraft delivered or pledged as resupply. On the surface, that might seem to suggest that the Ukrainian Air Force is in better condition now than when Russia invaded in February 2022. But for a variety of reasons, I'd suggest that's probably not the case. The Ukrainian Air Force has been flying hard and constantly for almost 2.5 years at this point, constantly displacing between different airfields, trying to evade Russian long-range strikes. As a result, that 97 figure should probably be considered a flaw, as other aircraft have likely been worn out or lost due to other factors. And likewise, that 128 figure probably doesn't include some reactivated airframes, in particular things like Sukhoi 24s. But the two most significant asterisks, I think, are A, delivery timelines that we'll talk about in a moment, and that secondly, losses and resupply aren't impacting different parts of the force evenly. On paper, for example, Ukraine's force of its most numerous fighter aircraft, the MiG-29, seems to basically be treading water. 30 MiG-29s have been visually confirmed destroyed or damaged since February 2022, while 27 MiG-29s are believed to have been delivered by Poland and Slovakia, although some of those were likely intended as parts donors. In recent weeks, Poland has raised the prospect of potentially sending another squadron of these aircraft to Ukraine, but likely only after it receives new aircraft to replace them. That pushes any potential timeline well out, so I haven't included them here. One of the many challenges for the Ukrainian MiG-29 fleet is that while replacements haven't quite covered visually confirmed losses, the number of tasks being assigned to the fleet has likely increased over time. We've seen the aircraft used to do things like hunt Russian drones or deploy HARM anti-radiation missiles against Russian air defense systems. And for a force that was estimated to have fewer than 40 active MiG-29 airframes at the time of the Russian invasion, even just those tasks alone would likely be a significant ask for the force, given the length of the Ukrainian front line. But as hard as things appear to have been for Ukraine's MiGs, the state of its Sukhoi 24 and 25 squadrons is likely even harder. Pre-invasion, the Sukhoi 25 was an important ground attack aircraft for both the Ukrainians and the Russians. Ukraine was estimated to have just over 30 active airframes of the type, and there are plenty of videos of Ukrainian pilots out there flying the type at altitudes so low that you might think it's an airshow manoeuvre, if not for the flashing lights on the radar warning system and the fact the pilots appear to be firing off volleys of rockets. As a rule, the use of live ammunition is generally discouraged during airshows. Remarkably, flying right up to the front line and then attacking with relatively short-range weapon systems appears to have been a highly dangerous exercise. And Ukraine has suffered the visually confirmed loss of 20 of the type since February 2022, against maybe 4 pledged replacements from abroad. In proportional terms, the visually confirmed losses have been even higher for Ukraine's fleet of Sukhoi 24 Fencers. These swing-wing strike aircraft appear to have been viciously hunted by the Russians because they're the ones capable of carrying Storm Shadow missiles, a weapon which has caused a number of very high-profile inconveniences for Russian forces, including the addition of some nice new ventilation holes to at least one Russian submarine. 19 Sukhoi 24s appear in the visually confirmed loss database, and the only replacements are believed to be the reactivation of stored Ukrainian models. In other words, as best we can tell, Ukraine's fixed-wing attack aviation has been worn down, over time, to a fraction of its pre-war strength. At least in raw quantitative terms, the offset for a lot of these losses is meant to be the American F-16. From relatively humble beginnings, the number of pledged F-16 airframes has steadily climbed. The figures reach roughly 95 at time of recording, which, if they all arrive tomorrow, would be enough to replace every aircraft Ukraine is visually confirmed to have lost since February 2022. However, as soon as you start to dive into the fine print, that 95 figure starts to come down significantly. Some of the airframes pledged, for example, are only ever intended to be parts donors, not operational aircraft. Another major issue is timelines. Belgium's pledged about 30 airframes, with the first to be delivered this year, but the final ones may not arrive until the end of 2027, meaning the final deliveries are hopefully much more relevant to Ukraine's post-war security position than the current invasion. There's a couple of times on this channel where we've discussed the debate around how much of a game-changer F-16 is likely to be and how its capabilities measure up against the various Soviet and Russian aircraft in play. But wherever you stand on that particular debate, I think there's one area where the potential impact of this platform in Ukraine is very clear. Whether you think F-16 is a bad plane, a good plane, or God's gift to fighter pilots, the fact is it is a plane. And if it wasn't for the effort to train Ukrainian pilots and ground crews, source these airframes and eventually get them to Ukraine, then the medium-term projection for the Ukrainian Air Force would probably be that the Russians would succeed in grinding it down to combat ineffectiveness. Realistically for Ukraine at this point, it isn't a choice between a fleet of F-16s or a fleet of Griffins or a fleet of F-18s or a fleet of F-35s, as hilarious as that would be. It's a choice between an F-16 fleet and not having a fleet. Russia has spent almost 2.5 years putting fewer than 100 Ukrainian aircraft on the visually confirmed loss list. F-16 has the potential to replace a lot of them, and with a platform compatible with a wider range of NATO weapon systems. Ukrainian pilots may not have a wonder weapon, but they will have a weapon. While the Russians face the prospect of basically having to start the process of destroying the entire Ukrainian Air Force all over again. The Russians have had a number of recent successes, flying reconnaissance drones deep into Ukrainian territory and then launching pinpoint strikes with systems like Iskander. But only time will tell whether the tempo of those strikes increases, decreases, or remains about the same. In terms of the combat power of the Ukrainian Air Force out into 2025, I think there are 3 other elements we need to cover. The first is the arrival of potential enablers, the kind of systems that may not be the most numerous, but might help Ukraine get the best out of the aircraft it has. The biggest example I can think of here is that Sweden has pledged to provide Ukraine with 2 light AWACS aircraft. These won't have the same capabilities as the much larger AWACS aircraft flown by forces like the USAF, but because they'll be under Ukrainian control, they'll be able to fly in Ukrainian airspace. And if they're deployed carefully, they might be fairly useful to Ukrainian defensive efforts. The second big question is whether some long hypothesized transfers will actually eventuate. We're talking, for example, about Mirage 2000s from France. We've been told that some will eventually be coming, but not how many or how soon. There's also been some discussion and speculation around Ukraine potentially sourcing some FA-18 Hornets, and reportedly more advanced discussions around Ukraine potentially receiving an aircraft almost custom designed for the war they're now fighting, the Swedish Gripen. It was first reported that Ukrainian pilots were testing and training on the type back in 2023, but so far we haven't heard any announcement that the aircraft will actually be delivered. Of all the fighters we've just discussed, airframe for airframe, the Griffin would arguably be the most useful, but in the absence of any announcement, it doesn't make it into our data. The final question has very little to do with airframes and everything to do with munitions. All else being equal, the combat value of a fighter or multi-role aircraft can vary wildly based on what's on the rails. Ukraine's MiG-29s and especially its Sukhoi 27s can have impressive performance characteristics, and compared to many NATO aircraft, they do. But they're also mostly stuck using a diminishing supply of old Soviet air-to-air and air-to-ground munitions. With the arrival of F-16s, the compatibility should be there to unlock much more of NATO's air-delivered arsenal. But we haven't heard much in the way of public announcements to supply any of those potential weapon systems. An F-16 equipped with the AGM-154 Joint Standoff weapon is going to be able to engage targets much further away than one using JDAM. And if the unlikely decision was ever made to supply them, an F-16 equipped with the longest range versions of the AGM-158 could potentially target airfields or industrial targets, a casual 500 plus miles into Russian territory. There would be nowhere in the Black Sea that Russian warships and submarines would be out of range, nor would there be any Russian fighter airbase within a useful distance of Ukraine that couldn't potentially be targeted. That's very much an extreme scenario, and given the demonstrated escalation appetite of the US government to date, a very, very unlikely one. But I think it's a reminder of how important it can be to talk ordnance, not just airframes. In terms of a very rough, uncertain overall picture, the Ukrainian Air Force started the war with a much deeper equipment deficit relative to its Russian opponents than did the Ukrainian ground forces. The technological and quantitative gap was much wider, and Russia has continued to make Ukrainian air power a primary target. Between advanced Russian air-to-air missiles, air defense systems and attacks on Ukrainian air bases, a significant portion of Ukraine's pre-war airframe inventory has probably been worn down at this point. Some, like the MiG-29s, have been broadly sustained by an infusion of new parts and airframes, while at this point the Fencer fleet, which continues to occasionally launch Storm Shadows, probably only exists in any sense at this point because of repaired, reactivated or repurposed airframes. But if nothing changed, the overall trend was unambiguously towards Ukraine running out of airframes over time. That's why the timing and scale of F-16 deliveries and any other Western jets that might eventually be announced are so important. The Ukrainian Air Force is arguably currently in a period of great vulnerability. It's lost 2.5 years' worth of airframes, but it hasn't really received its next generation yet. And while yes, we should expect to see F-16s shot down or destroyed in Ukraine, just as the MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s have been before them, the fact is they will be there, giving Ukrainian pilots something to fly and Ukrainian commanders options. But as to when we'll start seeing that transition happen in a big way, only time will tell. So where does that arguably leave us then in terms of some big picture observations around Ukrainian equipment losses and resupply as we go further into the second half of 2024? Just as with the Russian military, I think there's plenty of evidence that the Ukrainian military's equipment profile is changing. The difference is that while the age and quality of a lot of Russian equipment is going backwards over time, in Ukraine, the direction of travel on quality tends to be much more positive, although it is still a mixed bag. If you're replacing Soviet-era tanks with a Leopard 2A6, you can confidently say that's an upgrade. But change that Leopard 2 out for a Leopard 1, and it's a very different picture. If you want to move from talking quality to quantity, I think there are reasons for both Kyiv and Moscow to be deeply frustrated. In terms of some of the key heavy equipment categories, like tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, as we showed, Ukrainian forces are likely roughly treading water. There may have been some decline or growth in the scale of the force, but generally speaking, replacements and losses seem to be relatively evenly matched. And frankly, that's probably not the result either side is looking for. For Russia, it means that after almost 2.5 years of full-scale fighting, the expenditure of vast amounts of men and materiel, and deep withdrawals from the old Soviet stockpiles, their invasion to demilitarize the Ukrainian military is still very much at the starting line, or in some equipment categories has walked back a couple of metres and back into the stands. They also appear to be in the process of prosecuting a war they claim to partly be about keeping Ukraine away from NATO, and in the process driving the transformation of the Ukrainian military from an essentially post-Soviet force into a much more NATO-compatible one. If the Russian intent was to eventually win through grinding attrition, from an equipment perspective, they still have a very, very long way to go. On the other hand, from a Ukrainian perspective, supply matching losses is likely to be viewed as nowhere near sufficient. Even if the Ukrainian tank and IFV forces were exactly the same size as they were in February 2022, the Ukrainian army isn't. The country is mobilised, many new brigades have been established, and on paper, they should get equipment too. But especially when you're talking about some of the heavier and rarer stuff, think infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, or air defence systems, the evidence suggests that there just isn't enough to go around. We've seen reporting that some of the new brigades Ukraine intends to form are going to be infantry formations, not armoured or mechanised. And Ukrainian Commander Syrsky himself has reflected on the shortage of things like manpads and short-range air defence missiles. It's an interesting flip side to the general estimation that Russia is using more armour in Ukraine now than it was in February and March 2022. Russia has been able to dial up the number of tanks and armoured vehicles deployed in Ukraine through the relatively simple expedient of deploying a greater and greater percentage of its military there, as well as generating new units. Even if the equipment those generated or regenerated units are being issued is getting older and older. In general, I think, when it comes to things like tanks, IFVs and certain other equipment categories, the best characterisation is that Ukraine has been given enough equipment to sustain it in the fight and continue to hold back and grind down Russian forces, but it hasn't been given enough to enable it to build up its own strength and throw some more decisive blows in return. And I think while the data suggests that might be the case, I also think it's consistent with our broader observations about the war. After all, whenever a statistical model and reality disagree, reality wins and the model has to go back to the drawing board. In this case, our data suggests that Ukraine started with fewer tanks, IFVs or aircraft than Russia, has received considerably fewer replacements than Russia that has been able to pull things out of storage by the thousands, but at the same time has consistently been able to inflict disproportionate equipment losses. That seems consistent with the kind of grinding, slow-moving, attritional war that we're seeing in 2024. Whereas if Russia had been inflicting more losses than the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians had been receiving far more resupply, we probably would have expected to see the momentum of the fight shift more decisively in one direction or the other. There are a number of silver linings in Ukraine's equipment supply picture. Domestic production has reportedly been increasing, but largely hasn't been included in this analysis. Some high-quality systems have been provided, and there are some equipment categories, particularly light vehicles, where resupply volumes have far exceeded visually confirmed losses. Even if pulling together tank and IFV packages has occasionally been shaky, the MRAPs, IMVs and M113s have continued to flow. The unfortunate side of that, however, is that it means in some cases Ukrainian forces might be forced to use light vehicles when ideally a heavier option would be preferable. We have plenty of evidence of Ukrainian units using light elements like MRAPs or Humvees in offensive actions, not necessarily because they're always the right vehicle for the job, but because sometimes you just have to make do with what you've got. These systems are still obviously very useful for Ukraine in a variety of scenarios, and they'll probably want supplies to continue. But in the end, a Humvee is not an APC, and a metal box without a big gun is not the same as a metal box with a big gun. But perhaps the biggest question if you're trying to project the future of the Ukrainian military equipment park in 2024 and 2025 is what happens to the pipeline from here. A lot of countries have announced deliveries for the second half of this year and budgets for next year. But what we don't know is how elections and politics might see those budgets evolve in allied capitals, and what the plans are to convert some of that budget into equipment on the ground. The Ukrainian military has already overcome a number of logistics challenges in beginning to adopt NATO equipment. There's now better training and infrastructure in place to support Western systems like the Bradleys or various self-propelled guns. But the future trajectory of the force, and whether it can ultimately outlast Russia's own equipment reserves, will probably be shaped not just by when the already pledged equipment arrives, but by what comes next. And so, observers will probably remain laser-focused on watching the pipeline, as they try and assess where and if Ukraine will get the next 500 tanks, 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and all the other equipment it's going to want to have as this war carries on. And so while the Ukrainian military has clearly demonstrated that after almost 2.5 years of fighting, they're still very much capable of fighting hard defensive actions against the Russian force, it's absolutely showing the signs of the struggle as it tries to regenerate and adapt to NATO equipment in the middle of a full-scale war. Going forward, only time and allied political decisions, whether it's the Ukrainian or Russian equipment inventory, that ultimately starts to break down first. And okay, channel update to close out. Here, my main notes are that this video essentially functions as a second part to my previous video on Russian equipment losses, so if you haven't reviewed that one yet, please consider doing so. Secondly, to the patrons, you should expect to see a poll going up probably tomorrow, where I'm going to be seeking votes and comments on what charitable causes the channel should aim to support in the second half of this year. Finally, Perun Gaming fans, I know you have been waiting a long while, but there has finally been some new content posted over there, and I hope to return to Terra and Victor in the next couple of weeks as well. As always, my very best thanks to all of you watching and supporting the channel, and of course to Private Internet Access for their sponsorship today, and I do hope to see you all again next week.